It's late. I don't know what time it is exactly, and I stopped caring about that a while ago. The clock on the microwave keeps blinking because I never reset it after the power went out last spring, and I just let it blink. 12:00. 12:00. All day, all night, blinking like it's asking me a question I don't have the answer to. I sit here most nights now, in this chair by the window. The same chair. I've been sitting in it so long that the left armrest has worn down in a way that fits my elbow like it was built for me, which I suppose by now it was. I don't sleep much anymore. I close my eyes and the dark fills up fast with things I thought I'd buried. So I sit here instead. I look at the street. I watch the light from the neighbors' windows go out one by one, and when the last one goes, I feel something I can't name exactly. Not loneliness, something older than loneliness, something that doesn't have a word in any language I've ever known. I've been thinking about that. Dinner. I think about it most nights, if I'm being honest. And I am being honest. That's the whole point of sitting here. That's the whole reason I started talking out loud to nobody like this. Because there's nobody left who knew me when I was young. Nobody left who was there. And the silence gets so full of everything unsaid that it starts to feel like a pressure in my chest, and I have to release it somehow. So I talk. To nobody. To the dark. To whatever is listening. If anything is. The dinner. It was in my mother's house. Her house still. Even though I was the one paying for it. Even though I had been paying for it for 6 years by then, without a single word about it to anyone. Not because I was hiding it exactly, more because I was waiting for some moment that made sense to say it, waiting for some version of my family that could hear it the right way. That moment never came, and then the dinner happened, and then everything changed all at once, and I never stopped thinking about what would have been different if I had just said it sooner. I was 43 years old. 43. I know that sounds old when you're young, and young when you're old, and from where I'm sitting now, it sounds like another lifetime, another man entirely, except that I remember his hands, my hands, the way they sat flat on the table that night, the way I pressed them down against the tablecloth because I needed something solid. My father was at the head of the table. He always sat at the head, even when it wasn't his table, and even when, like that night, he had been living in an apartment we were all pretending not to know I was also quietly paying for. He sat there, like a king. That was just him. That was always him. Wide at the shoulders, even in his 70s, still had most of his hair, went grey in a way that some men do, where it looks dignified instead of just old. He commanded a room by breathing in it. I never had that. I inherited my mother's frame, my mother's way of taking up just enough space and no more. And I spent most of my life feeling like that was a deficiency. I spent a long time feeling like a deficiency. That's maybe where this whole story really starts. Not at the dinner table that night, not at the packets, not at the slow nod in the doorway. It starts somewhere in childhood, in a house where my father's way of being a man was the only visible template for what being a man looked like, and I didn't fit it, and I learned to understand my not fitting as a flaw rather than as a different form of the same thing. My father worked with his hands and then with his voice. He was in construction most of his working life, and then when his knees wouldn't allow the sight work anymore, he moved into supervising, into managing other men, into a role that suited him even more deeply because it was built entirely on presence and authority and the kind of certainty that makes men want to follow without being told to. He was good at it. I've thought many times over the years about whether my father would have been successful at what I did, whether he could have sat across a negotiating table and been patient, whether he could have held vision for a project through the long middle years when nothing looks like it's working. I think the answer is yes, probably, in a different world, with different access, with different roads open to him. He had the intelligence, and he had a version of the vision, but the roads available to him were the roads available to him, and he walked them the way men of his generation walked them, with a particular kind of dignity that came from not complaining about the road while you were on it. He never said things like, "I could have done more if the world had let me." That wasn't his language. His language was, "Here is what I did with what I had, and it was real, and it was enough, and don't look at me with pity." I understood that language. I respected it. I just didn't inherit it exactly. What I inherited was the version that went internal. The version that said, "Here is what I am doing, and it is real, and it is enough, and I don't need you to see it to know that it's true." I built the interior confirmation my father had always gotten from the exterior world. I built it inward because I didn't trust the exterior to give it back to me reliably. A black man in real estate in this country, in my era, the era of learning the business and building the contacts and sitting in rooms where the assumption about who belonged there was rarely me. I learned early not to look to the room for my confirmation. You look to the room, and sometimes the room gives it back, and sometimes it doesn't. And if you need it from the room, you are subject to the room in a way that will hollow you out eventually. So I stopped looking to the room. And then I stopped looking to anyone. And then I was 43, and my father called me a middleman, and the room laughed, and the room, in this case, was my family. And the thing I had been very careful not to need from the room turned out to still be somewhere inside me needing it. Just hidden. You can push a thing very deep and still be carrying it. I think I knew that in the abstract. I found it out in the specific on the night of the dinner. 11 people at the table. There were 11 of us at that table. My mother, my father, my brother Marcus and his wife Denise, my sister Paulette and her husband Ray, my cousin Terence, who had been living with me for 7 months by then, working for my company, though at dinner tables he sat like family, not like an employee. My Aunt Gloria, my mother's sister, who had been on my company's payroll as a bookkeeper for 2 years, though she took credit for the job like she had gotten it through her own cleverness. My niece Amara, Marcus's oldest, who I had given a junior coordinator position 6 months earlier because she had a degree and nowhere to use it, and Marcus had quietly asked me to help. And Ray's brother Dion, who I barely knew, who had been placed at one of my properties doing maintenance after Ray asked me to do them a favor that they both then seemed to forget had ever been asked. 11 people, 8 of them connected to my company in one direct way or another, 8 of them with paychecks that passed through something I had built from nothing, from a folding table in my apartment, from years of getting up before the sun and going to bed after midnight, from deals I had negotiated when I was so tired I could barely see the papers I was signing. None of them knew that I knew that they sometimes talked about me. The way they talked, the way families talk, in side conversations and hushed tones, in the particular silence that fills a room when you walk in and something was being said about you a moment before. I had heard fragments over the years, the way Marcus would say with a certain look on his face that I was always too serious. The way Paulette had said at some point, And I had heard this second-hand from a cousin who felt guilty for telling me that she didn't know why I had never done something more with my life, that I had gotten to my 40s, and what did I really have to show for it? What did I have to show for it? I think about that phrase even now. I think about it with a bitterness that has softened over the decades but never quite dissolved, the way scar tissue softens but never becomes regular skin again. What did I have to show for it? As if the showing was the point. As if anything I had built only counted if it was visible in the right way to the right people at the right dinner table. I was in real estate. I had a company. Not a large company by the standards of people who think about large companies, but a real one, with real employees, real properties, real accounts. I had started it in my mid-30s after years of working for other people in property management, learning their mistakes, learning their systems, watching them succeed despite themselves, and understanding slowly that the thing separating us was not intelligence or work ethic or vision. It was mostly access and the willingness to keep going past the point where stopping seemed reasonable. The access part. I want to say something about the access part because it is a real thing, and I spent many years pretending it wasn't a factor so that I could maintain the internal story of pure self-determination, which is a story that is true but incomplete. The truth is that I was a black man trying to establish himself in an industry that had specific ideas about where black men belonged in it. Not always stated, not always explicit, but present in the way that the second meeting was harder to get than the first. Present in the way that financing conversations required me to come in with twice the documentation and half the confidence if I wanted to be taken seriously. Present in the way that certain rooms I walked into, certain deals I tried to build, the other people in the room would redirect things slightly, would talk to the white colleague I sometimes brought along rather than to me, would address questions about my own proposal to someone else while I sat there holding the proposal. I learned to manage it, mostly by being better prepared than anyone expected and by not making my anger about it anyone else's problem in the room, because making it someone else's problem in the room costs you the room, and I needed the rooms. I saved the anger for the drive home. I processed it in private. I used it as fuel in a way that I think worked, and in a way that I also think contributed to the general habit of interiorizing everything. Because if you train yourself to put the real response away until you're alone, eventually you're putting everything away until you're alone, and eventually alone is where you are. I kept going. I kept going through a period when I lost 2 contracts in the same month and had to call my bank and of quiet. The years when nothing looked of quiet. The years when nothing looked impressive from the outside. When I drove a car that embarrassed me to park in front of certain buildings. When I wore the same 3 suits in rotation and hoped nobody noticed. I kept going through the period after my grandmother died and left me a small amount of money, not enough to change anything by most measures, but enough at exactly the right moment to allow me to make a decision I had been trying to figure out how to make for 2 years. I bought my first property, a small one, a building that needed work. I borrowed against the small inheritance, found a private lender who had worked with my boss at the property management company and trusted the reference, and I bought it. I spent nights and weekends and money I was carefully calculating down to the dollar making it livable. And then I rented it, and then I bought another one, and then the folding table became a desk, and the desk became an office, small, rented, mine. My family noticed nothing during those years. I didn't invite them to notice. I was superstitious about it, the way you get superstitious when something is fragile. I didn't want to show anyone the building before it was stable, because I knew that the opinions of people who love you can be the most dangerous opinions when you're doing something that requires you not to doubt yourself. People who love you and have made different choices will sometimes, without meaning to, with the best of intentions, hand you the shape of their own fear and call it wisdom. I didn't want to hold anyone's fear on top of my own. I had enough of my own to manage. So I went quiet about it. And in going quiet, I let the story fill in around me. My family noticed. Or rather, my family noticed the things that weren't there instead of the thing that was being built. They noticed that I didn't have a big house. They noticed that I wasn't married, which was its own ongoing conversation I'll come to eventually. They noticed that I talked about my work in a way that was vague, which I did on purpose, because I had learned early that talking about what I was building invited opinions from people who had not been invited to build it with me. I was protecting something fragile. You have to protect fragile things until they aren't fragile anymore. But my family read the vagueness as embarrassment. They read my caution as failure wearing a quiet face. So by the time of that dinner, there was already a story they had told themselves about me. A comfortable story. A story where Marcus, who worked in city government and wore a badge on his belt and knew people's names at the municipal building, was the successful brother. A story where Paulette, who had married into a family with a house in a good neighborhood and sent her kids to decent schools, had made the right choices. A story where I, the one who had gone off to do something vague with property and small business, who had never married, who drove a modest car and wore a modest watch and deflected questions about money with modest answers, was the one who had maybe not quite found his footing. That story was comfortable for them. I think people need comfortable stories about the people around them. It organizes the world. It tells you where you stand relative to everyone else, and if you can place somebody below you in the story, then the ground under your own feet feels firmer. I let the story exist. That was my mistake, or one of them. I let it grow for years without correcting it, partly out of pride, partly out of a principle I held about not needing to prove things, partly, I think, out of a habit of silence that went all the way back to childhood, to watching my father fill every room with his certainty and deciding very young that I would be different, that I would not insist, that I would hold things quietly and let them speak for themselves eventually. The eventually came and went, and I never spoke. So we were at the table. My mother had made her roast, the one she made for occasions, and there was rice, and there were greens, and there was cornbread that Paulette had brought, but that my mother had taken quietly into the kitchen and warmed up in a way that made it hers. We were eating and talking, the way families eat and talk. A dozen threads at once, people talking over each other gently, laughter in short bursts, the particular noise of people who know each other so well that they don't have to finish sentences. I was quiet. I am always quiet at these things. I eat and I listen, and sometimes I smile, and sometimes I add something small to the edge of a conversation without redirecting it. That's how I moved through family dinners. Then my father said my name. He said it in that way he had, that declarative way. Not a question, not exactly a statement, just my name hanging in the air like a door being opened. Everyone got slightly quieter. My father speaking with intention was an event. It always had been. He said he had been talking to someone. He didn't say who. He had been talking to someone, and this someone had mentioned a property deal in the area and had mentioned my company's name in connection with it. And my father wanted to know what was going on with that. I said it was ongoing. I said we were working on it. He made a sound. You know the sound that isn't a word, but carries a paragraph's worth of skepticism in it. A brief exhale through the nose, a slight pull at the corner of the mouth. He said he didn't understand exactly what it was that I did. He said it like that, not aggressive, not even unkind by his own measure. Just said it plainly, the way he said everything, as if plain was the same as fair. He said he had been thinking about it, and he wasn't sure I had ever really explained it properly. He said he knew I dealt with properties, but he didn't understand the business of it. He said in his day, a man either owned property or he worked for the man who did, and he wasn't sure where I fit in that picture exactly. And then he said it. He said, "Boy, are you sure you're not just a middleman for somebody else's money?" He said it conversationally. He said it the way you'd ask someone to pass the salt. And the table, my table, the table of people drawing from my company's accounts in one form or another, the table that I had contributed to in more ways than any of them had acknowledged or perhaps even understood, that table laughed. Not a cruel laugh. I want to be precise about this because the cruelty of it being small is somehow worse than if it had been large. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh that happens when a patriarch says something with confidence and the family reflects that confidence back at him like a mirror. It was the laugh of people who had already decided where I stood in the story and were pleased to have it confirmed. Marcus laughed with his mouth full. Paulette made a sound like she was trying not to laugh, and then laughed anyway. Denise smiled into her plate. Gloria, my aunt, who had been on my payroll for 2 years, who deposited my company's check into her bank account every 2 weeks, laughed a quiet, polished laugh and shook her head gently, like my father had just said something wise. Terence didn't laugh. I remember that. Terence looked at his plate and was quiet, and I noticed it and I stored it away. I pressed my hands flat against the tablecloth. I felt something that I have tried to name many times in the years since, and can never name precisely. It wasn't rage, exactly. Rage is hot, and I was cold. It wasn't hurt exactly, because hurt implies surprise, and I was not surprised. It was something underneath both of those things, something older, something that had been accumulating for a long time and had in that moment reached a level it couldn't stay at. I didn't say anything. I smiled. God help me. I smiled. I said something deflecting, something to the effect that it was complicated to explain, and I picked up my fork, and the conversation moved on, and I sat at that table for another hour and ate my mother's roast and listened to my father hold court and watch my family laugh and talk and be a family. And I felt outside of it, in a way that I had sometimes felt before, but never so sharply as that night, never so clearly, never so finally. I drove home alone. I had about 40 minutes in the car, and I didn't play music. I just drove. The city passed outside the windows, and I watched it without seeing it, and somewhere in those 40 minutes, something settled in me. Not a decision, exactly. More like a recognition. The recognition that I had been managing other people's comfort with the truth for long enough, that the story they had told about me was only possible because I had allowed it. That silence isn't humility. Not always. Sometimes silence is just surrender, dressed up quiet. I got home. I sat in what was then a different chair, in a different house, a younger chair, a chair that didn't have the groove my elbow made in this one. I sat there and I thought about it for a long time. And then I went to bed. The next morning I made some phone calls. I called my office manager first. I told her I needed certain documents prepared by end of business. I told her what they were. She asked no questions because she was good at her job and had learned that I didn't explain myself unless I was ready to. And she said she would have everything ready. Then I called Marcus. Marcus answered on the second ring in the voice he uses when he's surprised. It's me, the voice that's trying to be casual but has a little note of something in it, a little note of wondering what this is about. I told him I needed him to come by my office that afternoon if he could, said he had work. I said I understood. I just needed an hour if he could manage it. He said he'd try. Then I called Paulette, same conversation roughly. Then I called Ray. Then I called Terence. Then I called Gloria. I did not call my father. That was specific and intentional, and I have thought about it many times since, whether it was cowardice or strategy or simple clarity about what I could and couldn't do in a single day, and I'm still not certain. I think the truth is that I understood my father and I understood what facing him directly would cost me emotionally, and I was not ready to spend that yet. I needed to do the other thing first. They came. Not all at the same time. I staggered it. But over the course of that afternoon, they came to my office one by one, or in some cases in pairs, and they sat across from my desk and they looked at the office, some of them for the first time, which told me something. They looked at the actual space I worked in, the filing cabinets and the second desk where my office manager sat, and the wall where I kept framed copies of my first 3 signed contracts, and the window that overlooked a small parking lot that I also happened to own. And they looked at these things with expressions I was careful to read. Marcus looked at the framed contracts first. He looked at them for longer than was casual. I had prepared packets. My office manager had prepared packets, really, because she was better at that than me, and because I had asked her to include things she knew I might forget. Each packet was specific to the person receiving it. Each packet contained, in plain language with supporting documents attached, a clear accounting of their relationship to my company. I didn't make a speech. I'm not a speech person. I sat down and I told them I wanted to clear some things up. I said I should have done this a long time ago, and the fact that I hadn't was on me. I slid the packets across the desk. Then I let them read. Watching Marcus. Read was something I will carry with me until I die. He's a reader, Marcus. He reads methodically. He moves his eyes across a page in a way that's almost audible. I watched his face while he read. I watched the expression change, not dramatically, not the way it would in a film. It changed the way weather changes on a clear day, when a cloud starts building at the edge of the sky. Slowly, and then faster. And then you realize it was always coming. You just hadn't been watching the edge of the sky. He read that his brother's company had been contracted to manage the building where he and Denise had lived for the past 4 years at a below-market rate, because I had quietly arranged it when I heard that they were having trouble with rent. He read that the parking space he used at his office building cost less than the going rate because of a business relationship I had with the owner of that building. He read the number, the actual number of what that had amounted to, those 4 years, that below-market rate, compounded across months. He put the packet down. He looked at the wall. Not at me. At the wall, somewhere to the left of my head. He said, "James. That's my name. James." He said it the way my father said my name the night before, that declarative drop, except where my father's had been the precursor to a question about my worth. Marcus's was the precursor to something else, something I didn't have a word for either. I said, "I'm not telling you this to make you feel any kind of way. I'm telling you because you deserve to know." He said, "Why didn't you say anything?" I said, "I'm saying it now." He sat there for a long time. He's a big man, Marcus, bigger than me, always has been. And he has a stillness when something has genuinely gotten through to him that is different from his ordinary stillness. He was very still. Then he said, "Daddy talked to you like that last night." I said, "Yeah." He didn't say anything for a while. Then he picked up the packet again and looked at the numbers again and put it back down. I won't go through every conversation. They each took their own shape. Paulette cried quietly, the way she cries, with her hand pressed against her mouth and her eyes very wide. Ray was defensive at first. He asked questions about the numbers. He wanted to know if there was interest owed. He approached it like a transaction before something shifted in him, and he got quiet and stopped asking about interest. Gloria left without saying much, and I didn't hear from her for 3 weeks, and when I finally heard from her, it was a brief message that said she was grateful and sorry, and she didn't know what else to say, which was more than I expected. Terence, when he came in, sat down, and before I could begin, he said, "I figured something like this was true." I said, "Then why didn't you say something at dinner last night?" He said, "Because it wasn't my place." I sat with that for a while. It wasn't his place. That phrase. What it meant about what he understood about the family and what he understood about me. Terence and I are still close. He's one of the few. He's the only person from that family dinner who I still talk to regularly, who still calls on a Tuesday just to check, who comes by when he's in the area without there needing to be a reason. The others. The others were complicated after that in ways that took years to fully understand. Marcus and I went through a period of distance that lasted almost 2 years. He didn't know how to be around me, and I didn't know how to be around the version of him who now knew what he knew. There was an awkwardness in it, a reshuffling of roles that neither of us had been prepared for. I think he had spent so long in the story where he was the more successful brother that losing that story was like losing a floor he hadn't known he was standing on. I don't say this to diminish him. Marcus is a good man. He works hard and he loves his family, and he has never in his life done anything that I would call shameful. He just needed a story, and that story happened to cost me something. We found our way back eventually. It took longer than it should have, and the closeness was never the same shape as before, which I think is just the truth of it. Some things get repaired, and some things get replaced, and some things you just learn to work around. Like a door that doesn't close quite flush anymore, but still closes. My father is where the story gets complicated in a way that I am still sitting here in this chair tonight, still unresolved about. I didn't call him that day. I didn't send him a packet. I waited. I waited almost 3 weeks, which was probably too long, and probably its own statement. But I needed to know what I wanted to say before I said it, and knowing what I wanted to say to my father has never been a quick process. When I went to see him, it was at his apartment. Our apartment, in the sense that I was paying for it. Though even as I knocked on the door, I was aware of the strangeness of that, of knocking on a door You're quietly providing while preparing to have a conversation that nobody prepared you for how to have. He opened the door, and he stepped back to let me in, and he had that look he always had when he couldn't read why I was there. A careful look. My father was many things, but he wasn't a fool, and he could read a room better than almost anyone I've known, and something in my face or my posture told him this was different. We sat. I didn't bring a packet. I had thought about it and decided against it. My father wasn't going to respond to paper. My father responded to men, to what a man said to his face, to presence, to directness. So I sat across from him without paper. I told him, not everything, not the totality of it, not the way I had spread it out in neat documented packets for the others. I told him the main thing. I told him that his apartment was paid for by me. I told him that the dinner he had just attended, the food, the house, the general stability that allowed my mother to host that dinner without financial anxiety was something I had been quietly providing for 6 years. I told him about the others. I didn't go into detail. I just told him the general shape of it. I told him, and then I was quiet, and I let him be with it. My father sat very still. He sat the way men of a certain generation sit when something has genuinely surprised them, and they have made a decision not to show that they are surprised. He looked at his hands. He looked at the window. He looked at me. Then he said, "Why didn't you say?" I said, "I don't know, Daddy." That was the truest thing I said in that entire period. I genuinely did not fully know. There were reasons, partial reasons, the pride and the principle and the habit of silence. But underneath all of them was something I couldn't quite reach, something about him specifically, something about needing him to see it without being told, which is an impossible thing to need from a person. And I understood that even then. You can't need someone to see a thing that you're actively hiding. That's a contradiction you build into yourself and then blame the other person for living inside of. He said, "I talked to you like a fool last night." I said, "Yeah." He said, "In front of everybody." I said, "Yeah." And then my father, this man who had commanded rooms by breathing in them, this man who had never once in my entire childhood offered an apology for anything in any form that I could recognize, this man looked at me and his eyes got wet. They didn't spill. He didn't cry. But they got wet in a way I had never seen, and I have not been able to unsee it since. He said, "I didn't know, son." I said, "I know." He said, "I should have known." I said, "How would you have known?" He didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer. He should have known because a father should know what his son is carrying. That's the argument. That's what the wet eyes were about, I think. Not just embarrassment about the dinner, not just shock at the numbers, but something that went further back, something about the years of not knowing, something about a son who had learned to be quiet about important things, and a father who had not noticed that his son was being quiet about important things, and the particular grief of understanding that only in retrospect. We didn't repair it quickly. We didn't repair it the way it repairs in stories, with tears and embraces and some declaration of understanding. We sat in the apartment for another hour and we talked about ordinary things, the way people do when something large has just been said and they need the ordinary to make it habitable. And then I left and I drove home and I sat in that different chair in that different house, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, like I had put something down, that I hadn't realized how heavy it was until I wasn't carrying it anymore. My father and I had 3 more years before he died. 3 years isn't nothing. I've seen people lose their fathers before they could say anything at all, and I'm grateful for the 3 years. I hold the 3 years carefully. But I also know that the 3 years were not the full thing. We were better. We were more honest than we had been in the decades before. He started asking me real questions about my work, real questions, and listening to the answers in a new way, in the way that tells you someone is hearing, not just cataloging. He came to my office once, just once, near the end when the travel was harder for him. He stood in the doorway and looked around the way Marcus had looked around, and then he looked at me, and he nodded, slow. And I understood that as something, even if it wasn't everything. But we never talked about the dinner again. Not directly, not the way it deserved to be talked about. We went around it. We covered it with the 3 years of better behavior, the way you cover a stain in a wall with fresh paint. And when he died, I stood at his grave, and I felt the incomplete thing, the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue. Couldn't stop going back to it. Couldn't stop wondering what would have happened if I had said it sooner. If I had said it 5 years before the dinner, 10 years before. If I had built the kind of family where a man could say, I'm carrying a lot of this, and have that land somewhere useful instead of just hanging in the air. I made so much of this myself. That's what I'm sitting here with tonight. That's the thing that doesn't stop. The understanding that the silence was mine. I chose it. I chose it for reasons that made sense to me, and I protected it, and I cultivated it for years. And then I was surprised when my family grew comfortable inside a version of me that the silence had let them construct. You don't get to control the story by not telling the story. You just lose the story. Somebody else tells it for you, and they tell it with whatever materials they have, which means they tell it with the absences you left. My father told a story about me with my absences. A middleman, maybe. Somebody managing somebody else's money. Because the real story had too many walls around it. I think about the word middleman. I think about it more than makes sense. It's not an insult, technically. A middleman is a real thing, a functional thing. There is nothing inherently shameful about being a middleman. But in my father's mouth that night, in that context, with that slight exhale through the nose, it was meant to place me somewhere. It was meant to say, you are between things. You are not the thing itself. You facilitate, you manage, you exist in the margins of other people's real work. And the laugh. The table laughing. I have to say something about the laugh because I have thought about it so many times and from so many angles that it has become almost abstract to me, like a word you repeat until it loses meaning, except it never quite loses meaning. It just shifts meaning. It opens up new meanings I wasn't expecting. Terence didn't laugh. That matters. But the rest of them did, and they didn't know. And that's the part that has weight, that the not knowing is what allowed it. Ignorance makes people comfortable in ways that knowledge makes complicated. They laughed because, in their version of events, in the story that my silence had let them build, my father was making a fair and slightly gentle observation about a son who had done okay, but not great. The laugh was the laugh of confirmation, of a shared truth being named out loud. If they had known, would they have laughed? I've asked myself that question for 30 years, and I don't know the answer, and I'm not sure knowing the answer would change anything, because the knowing wasn't the point. The point was that I had built something real, and the people sitting closest to me were living inside it without any understanding of where they were sitting, and a significant part of that was my doing. The woman I loved. I keep circling away from her, and then back. That's how memory works at this hour. It doesn't move in lines. Her name was Constance. We met in my early 30s, before the company was what it became, when it was still the folding table and the long nights and the conviction I had to maintain with my own hands because nobody was going to maintain it for me. She was an architect. She had a particular way of looking at spaces that was different from how other people looked at spaces. She looked at what a space could be rather than what it was, which I understood immediately because it was how I looked at properties and how I had trained myself to look at my own life. She was also the most direct person I had ever known. She said what she meant. She said it plainly, without performance, without cruelty, but without softening. That served nobody either. I was not accustomed to that. I had been raised around people who communicated in indirection, in what wasn't said, in the shape around the word, rather than the word itself. And Constance just said the word. I found it startling, and then I found it beautiful, and then, later, I found it threatening in a way I was too proud to admit at the time. She asked me early in our relationship what I was actually building. Not in a dismissive way, not the way my family's silence on the subject sometimes felt dismissive. She genuinely wanted to know. She sat across from me at a table in a restaurant I had chosen carefully because I wanted to impress her, and she leaned forward with her chin in her hand, and she said, "Tell me about what you're making." I told her. I actually told her that night, more than I had told anyone. I told her about the first property and the lender and the nights of work. I told her where I wanted the company to be in 5 years, what it would look like, how many properties, what kind, what neighborhoods, what I believed about the way property management could be done differently and more responsibly than I had seen it done at the companies I'd worked for. I talked for a long time, and she listened the way she listened, completely, with her full attention like a physical thing in the room. She said, "You're not uncertain about any of it." I said, "About what?" She said, "About whether it's real, about whether you can do it. Most people who are building something spend a lot of time asking themselves if they really can. You don't ask." I didn't know what to say to that. It was accurate. I had doubt, plenty of doubt. But it was not the kind of doubt that asked the fundamental question. The fundamental question I had answered for myself somewhere in my mid-20s, and I didn't revisit it much. She said, "That's not arrogance. Don't mistake me. It's something else." I said, "What is it?" She said, "I don't know yet, but I'd like to know. We were together for 4 years. She left because I wouldn't let her in, not because she didn't try. She tried. She asked questions, and I deflected them. She reached toward the parts of me I was protecting, and I moved them gently out of reach in a way that I was so practiced at I didn't always notice I was doing it. There were evenings when I could feel her looking at me across a room with a look that was asking something, and I would read the look and understand what it was asking, and then I would respond to something easier, something adjacent, something that kept the conversation moving without letting it go where she was trying to take it. She wasn't asking about money. That's important to say. She never cared about money in the way some people do, as a measure of worth, as a status transaction. What she wanted was the rest of me, the part that sat in the apartment late at night, processing the things that happened and never saying them out loud to anyone. The part that felt the humiliations of certain business rooms and drove home in silence. The part that had grown up in my father's house and concluded something about itself that I was still carrying in a way I hadn't fully mapped. She wanted to be a person I talked to, and I was so committed to not needing, to being the man who held it all inside and made the interior strong enough to not require the exterior, that I kept her at a careful arm's length from the things that would have made me human to her in the right way. She said at the end, the night she told me she was leaving, she said, "James, I have been trying to know you for 4 years, and I feel like I'm still on the outside of something. I couldn't argue with it. I sat with it the way I had learned to sit with things. Still. Quiet." She said she didn't want to be outside anymore. She said she deserved to be inside, and she didn't think I knew how to let anyone inside. She wasn't wrong. I have thought about that many times. She wasn't wrong about any of it. I had built the habit of silence, and then I was applying it to her, to the one person who was asking most clearly to be an exception, and I couldn't make the exception. Or I didn't. I need to be honest. Couldn't suggest a limit I reached. The truth might be that I didn't, that I made a choice every time she reached and every time I moved a little away, and those choices accumulated into 4 years, and then into her leaving, and then into me sitting in a different chair, in a different time, looking at it from far enough away that the truth has had room to expand into its full shape. She married someone else, eventually. I heard this through a mutual contact years later, not because I was keeping track, but because the world is a smaller place than it pretends to be. An engineer. They have 2 daughters. I have seen, in the way that you occasionally see things without seeking them, a photograph of her from someone's birthday gathering, taken years after we ended, and she looked the same in the essential way. That directness, that presence, the chin-in-hand posture, like she's genuinely attending to whatever is in front of her. I was glad for her. I mean that without complication. I was glad that she found someone who could be inside with her the way I couldn't, and underneath, glad there was something else that I don't think requires a name to be real. I have been alone since Constance, not without people. I have had company. I have had friendships. I have had people who mattered to me. But alone in the way she meant, in the interior way. The inside of things has mostly stayed mine. I don't know if I regret that more than the dinner, or if they're the same regret at different angles. The dinner was 1 night, 1 hour, 1 conversation I could point to and say, there, that's where it was. The thing with Constance spread across years, and the loss of it spread across more years, and still spreads. I think, even now, even sitting here in the dark, at whatever time the blinking microwave thinks it is. There was a child. I need to say this part. Constance was pregnant in the 3rd year we were together. It was early enough that we hadn't told anyone. Early enough that the thing was still mostly hope and possibility, and the particular terror that comes with hope and possibility when you haven't been ready for it. We were sitting in her kitchen when she told me, and I remember the quality of light in that kitchen, the way it came in through the window above the sink in the late afternoon, the way it fell across the table and across her hands, which she was holding flat on the surface in front of her. And I remember that my first feeling, the first thing before thought arrived, was something I didn't have a word for. Not fear, not joy exactly either. Something that combined them and sat between them. Something large and very still. I said, "Okay." She looked at me a long time. Then she said, Okay. I said, yeah, okay. She smiled. A real smile. The kind where everything in the face changes. She reached across the table and held my hand, and we sat there in the kitchen, light, and didn't say anything for a while. And I think those minutes were among the most genuine of our 4 years together. Maybe because neither of us had any strategy for it yet, any plan or habit, just the fact of it. Then it wasn't. It stopped being a possibility in the way those things sometimes stop, quietly and suddenly, and with a medical word that doesn't carry enough weight for what it means. She called me from her doctor's office. Her voice on the phone was very controlled, very steady, the way voices get when people are working very hard to keep them that way. I drove to the doctor's office and I sat with her in a waiting room chair and I held her hand, and I did not know what to say, so I said very little, and I held her hand. We didn't talk about it enough after. That's the long and the short of it. Constance needed to talk about it, and I didn't know how, and so I was present in body and absent in the way that mattered, and she moved through her grief with me beside her, but not beside her. And I think that was the beginning of the ending of us, even though we had another year and a half after that, before she said what she said. I don't know if she understood it that way. I never asked. By the time I understood it that way, she was someone else's wife, and the conversation was not available anymore. What I know is that in the weeks after, I watched her grieve in a way that was clear and direct and visible, the way she did everything, and I grieved in my way, which was to go inward and be quiet about it and keep working, because keeping working was what I did with things that were too large to hold still, and we were in the same house doing 2 different things that both had the same name, and neither of us knew how to build a bridge between them. She needed me to grieve with her, out loud, in the same direction, and I didn't know how to do that. I had never been taught, and I had deliberately not taught myself, because teaching yourself to grieve openly means deciding that something outside of you is allowed to see the inside of you. And I was not ready to decide that. Not fully. Not even for Constance. Not even for this. That's the thing I have the hardest time sitting with. Not the dinner. Not my father's nod. This. That when something real required me to come outside the interior, I couldn't do it. I kept a woman I loved at the distance of my habit when she needed me closest, and I did it without choosing it, which means I had let the habit run so deep that it made choices ahead of me without permission. I think about that child sometimes. I don't know if I should say that. I don't know what it means exactly to think about something that was only possibility. But I think about it the way you think about a road you didn't take. You imagine where it might have gone. You imagine yourself on it. You imagine what kind of man you might have been as a father. Whether the silence would have broken for a child, even though it didn't break for much else. I like to think I would have been a different kind of father than my father was. And then I remember that my father probably thought the same thing about his father, and his father about his, and this is maybe the oldest wishful thought in the history of men, that we will be different, that we have identified what was wrong and will correct it. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes it really is different. But I know myself. I know the depth of the habit. I know what I was willing and unwilling to do, even when it cost me Constance, who was worth more than any version of my silence. I might have been the same. I sit with that. The company grew. After the dinner, after the conversations, after everything that needed to be said was finally approximately said, the company continued to grow in the way that things grow when you have spent years laying groundwork that nobody was watching. I hired more people, not all family, mostly not family. After a certain point, because I had learned something about the particular complications of family on a payroll, I expanded into new areas. I made some decisions I was proud of and some I was not. I lost a property I should have kept and kept one I should have let go. I mentored some young people who came up well and some who didn't. I had good years and thin years, and eventually I sold a portion of the company and then another portion, and now I have enough of whatever enough is, and what I don't have is anyone to pass it to in the direct sense, because I never had children, and the habit of silence kept the interior too clear of people. I think about the young people I mentored sometimes. There are 3 or 4 of them who went on to do real things. One of them runs his own firm now. He sends me a card every year at Christmas, and sometimes a message out of nowhere when something good happens, which is more than I expected and more than I asked for. I think he understands something about what was handed to him, even if we never talked about it in those terms. He's a quiet man too, actually. I noticed that early. A quietness that isn't shyness. A quietness that's holding something. I hope his people know. I hope he doesn't let it go as long as I did. The night I'm in now, the neighborhood outside my window is different from any neighborhood I've lived in before. It's quieter. People here go to bed early, real early, and by 11 the street is nearly empty, and by midnight it could be the set of something abandoned. I moved here after I sold the largest piece of the company. I wanted quiet. I got it, and for the first years I wasn't sure it suited me, and now I'm not sure I could live without it. My mother is still alive. She's 87, and she lives with Paulette, which was Paulette's choice and my mother's preference, not mine. And I was honest enough with myself to understand that my mother and I have our own history of distance that is separate from my father and the dinner and all the things I've been talking about. My mother loved me in ways that were absolutely true, and in ways that were about her, and in the particular complicated way that parents love the children who are most unlike them, which I was. I was unlike both of them in the fundamental ways. I visit her once a month. She's good on her good days, and on the other days she asks me questions about my father that I answer carefully. I never tell her what I've been thinking about all these years. I don't know what that would give her at 87. I don't know what it would give me. Some things I have made my peace with. Some things I have made a kind of truce with, which is not the same thing, but is what's available. The dinner I have mostly made a truce with. The thing with Constance, I have made something between a peace and a truce, the kind of arrangement where I don't look directly at it, but I've stopped pretending it isn't there. The father thing. The father thing I'm still working on. I think when you love someone and you needed something specific from them and you didn't get it and they died before you could fully stop needing it, that's the one that doesn't conclude. That's the one that stays at the table with you in the quiet house. That's the one you carry into the late nights and the blinking microwave clocks and the chairs that have molded themselves to your shape. I needed him to see me without being shown. I know that's an unreasonable thing to need. I've always known. It doesn't stop being what I needed. He said he didn't know, son. He said I should have known. I said, how would you have known? There was no answer because the answer was I should have been looking. I should have been the kind of father who was looking at his son in a way that would have found it. And maybe I should have been the kind of son who didn't make it so necessary to look. Maybe we both failed a thing between us. Maybe that's the long and ordinary truth of it, that two people can fail the same thing simultaneously from different directions, and there's no clean assignment of fault. There's just the thing that didn't happen, and the people left standing in its absence. I've thought about what I needed from him, in specifics, not the general thing, the seeing, the acknowledgement, but the specific moments where I needed something, and either asked for it in a way he didn't understand, or didn't ask at all. I needed him to come to my high school graduation with his full attention. He came. He was physically present. But he spent most of the reception talking to another father about construction bids, and I stood at the edge of the conversation with my diploma in my hand, and understood something that I didn't have words for until much later. That his presence was not the same as his attention, that a man can be in a room without being in it in the way you need. I needed him to say once that he had noticed I was serious, that he had noticed I was working at something. Not praise, not pride necessarily, just acknowledgement. Just, I see that you are carrying something real, son. That was the exact shape of what I wanted, and I never got it, and I spent 40 years filling in the gap with my own certainty, and doing it well enough that from the outside it looked like I didn't need the sentence at all. I didn't need it, and I needed it constantly, both things true at the same time. That's the kind of thing that doesn't resolve. You can carry a need and also make yourself strong enough not to be destroyed by it, and both the carrying and the strength are real, and neither one cancels the other. I was strong. I also needed something I didn't have. I built something real, and I spent decades wondering if my father had noticed. And then at 83, he stood in my office doorway. He was with my mother, who had insisted on coming, who was small and bright-eyed, and walked through my office, touching things gently, the way she touched everything, like she was being introduced to them. She said she had always known I was doing something real. She said it the way mothers sometimes say things that make you understand they were carrying a thing they never said aloud. I asked her why she hadn't said it before, and she looked at me with her eyes very steady and said, "James, you never asked." And I didn't know what to do with that, because she was right and she was also wrong, and the distance between those two things is where a lot of my life has lived. My father stood in the doorway and looked around, and then he looked at me and he nodded. Slow. One nod. I nodded back. We didn't speak for a moment. My mother was touching the framed contracts and saying something about the frames being nice, and my father and I stood together in the doorway of what I had built and looked at each other and said nothing and said something. That is the most I have ever gotten from him, and I am still grateful for it, and still, even now, still wish it had been more, and wish it had come sooner, and wish I had created more conditions for it to be possible, rather than holding the interior so tight that he never had a surface to knock on. He nodded at my office. I keep coming back to that, him standing in the doorway and looking around and nodding. Slow. One nod. The kind that doesn't need a follow-up because it's carrying something that doesn't need to be unpacked into words. I think he was proud. I think he had been proud for longer than he had known how to say. And the not knowing how to say it was his version of my silence. which is maybe the thing I should have understood about him decades before I did, that the silence was shared, that the habit lived in the family line the same way some things do, passed not through genes exactly, but through observation, through watching how the men around you manage the interior and concluding quietly that this is how it's done. He managed it with command, with presence, with filling rooms. I managed it with absence, with going quiet, with giving without saying. Different expressions of the same instruction. Don't be visible about the important things. I'm trying now, later than it does much good, to be different with what's left. That's what the late night talking is about, maybe. The talking to nobody, to the dark, to whatever is listening. A practice in saying the thing without knowing what will be done with it. A practice in letting the interior be less interior. It's a strange thing to practice at 71. I find I am less afraid of it than I expected. The fear I had was always about what would happen when people saw clearly, when the story was corrected, when the real thing was available. And what happened when I finally let it be seen? At 43, at that office, with those packets, was mostly just quiet. Mostly just people sitting with a truth they hadn't had before. Paulette cried. Marcus stared at the wall. My father's eyes got wet and didn't spill. The world did not reorganize. Nobody ran. The sky stayed up. I could have done it sooner. That's the hardest simple sentence I know. I could have done it sooner. Not just the company, not just the money, not just the specific form of the revelation. I could have been more visible sooner, more available. I could have let Constance inside. I could have called my father more and not waited for him to call me, and let the waiting become a contest neither of us acknowledged we were having. I could have said to Marcus years before that dinner, "Hey, I'm doing something real. I don't know if you see it, but it's real." I could have needed acknowledgement out loud, like a regular person. Instead of turning the needing into a wound I kept private, and then was surprised to find infected. I could have. I didn't. That's all. That's the whole of it, really. The years, and the dinner, and the father, and the woman, and the child that wasn't, and the company, and the late nights, and the chair with the groove in the armrest. The whole of it comes down to the gap between what I could have done and what I did. And the gap isn't bottomless. It's not a tragedy. I know real tragedies. People whose gaps were made by forces outside themselves, by the world refusing them things no act of will could have obtained. Mine was mostly mine. The gap was mostly mine. That's not a comfortable thing to hold, but it's a real one. I held my silence and I built my company and I supported my family without telling them I was supporting them, and I let the story run. And then one night my father called me a middleman in my mother's kitchen, and the table laughed, and I pressed my hands flat, and I smiled, and I drove home. And then the next morning I told the truth. Late, imperfect, incomplete, with packets and carefully staged conversations, and still not managing to tell my father face to face without waiting 3 weeks, still not managing to say the thing underneath the thing, which was not I have been paying for everything, but I needed you to see me, and I didn't know how to ask for that, and I made the not asking a structure I lived in, and the structure was strong enough to house the silence for years, but it cost me things I didn't know I was paying. It cost me Constance. It cost me the version of my father who had more than 3 years to know his son properly. It cost me the interior life of my own family for 2 decades. I think about what I bought with it. I bought a company. I bought the satisfaction, of doing it without anyone watching, without owing the outcome to anyone's witness. I bought a kind of integrity that was real even if it was private. I bought the right to know my own effort without it being mediated through other people's approval. That was worth something. I don't want to pretend it wasn't. The privacy of it, the purity of it, the building of a thing that was mine before it was anyone's story, that was worth something. I just bought it at a price I didn't fully read before I paid it. The street outside is empty now. Last light went out about 20 minutes ago. Now it's just the orange of the street lamps and the occasional car moving through without stopping and the sound of the city doing the thing it does at this hour, which is not quite silence, but is the closest thing to it that a city knows. I should sleep. I know I should sleep. But there's something about saying it all out loud, even to nobody, even to the dark and the blinking clock and the window and the empty street. Something that makes the inside of the chest feel slightly less pressured, like opening a window in a room that's been closed too long. The room is the same room. Nothing about it changes. The walls are where the walls are. But there's air now where there wasn't. My father's nod. I'm going to end here with his nod, because I can't think past it tonight. That single slow nod in the doorway of my office near the end of his life. The thing that didn't need to be unpacked into words. I've unpacked it, anyway, over and over, in the years since. I've asked it questions. I've accused it of being too little too late, and then I've defended it as the best he could do with what he had and what he knew. I've held it up in different lights to see what it shows. Tonight it looks like, I see you. Tonight it looks like a man who ran out of a certain kind of time and used what was left of it to do the thing he'd been doing wrong. Which is maybe the most I can say for myself, too. I see you. I'm saying it now. Maybe that's what this is. Maybe all of this. The late nights, the talking to nobody, the running through it again and again, from the dinner, to the drive home, to the packets, to the wet eyes, to the nod in the doorway. Maybe all of it is just me finally saying, I see you. To the younger version, who held everything so tight, to the father I couldn't quite reach, to Constance, who deserved to be inside, to the child that wasn't, to the version of the family that might have existed if I'd been less quiet about the important things. I see you. It's late. The arm of the chair is what it is. The clock blinks 12:00. The street is empty. I'm tired now. That's all. I'm just tired.